Um, and someone will be in charge each week of reminding me to record them and to post them. So thank you everyone for being on our session. Let's start digging.
All right, thank you, Rabbi Riegler. As we've said, I think it was more like 900 years ago that we worked together, but this is great, and I'm very excited to be back in Philadelphia. While even though it's in virtual reality, my name's Gadi Bendov. I was born in New York. I moved to Israel when I was 6 months old with my parents, who were members of Habonim, and went to Kibbutz Gesher Haziv, which is in the upper left-hand corner near Rosh Hanikra, Nahariya, the border with Lebanon on the Mediterranean. And then I spent 10 years in the States, although I can talk English with the Israeli accent also to give you the full effect. I can do every now and then just to remind you you're talking to an Israeli. I spoke English at home growing up, and I'm thrilled to be here. Actually, my parents divorced and my mom remarried to a nice Jewish boy from Broomall. And I used to come and visit Grandmom and Pop-Pop that lived on Cedar Grove Road in Broomall, if I'm sure you guys know where it is. So I've been to Broomall, and actually I have two aunts that live in Havertown, which I think is not that far either. So I've been to Philly many times. Oddly enough, we never actually went downtown to see the Liberty Bell and all of that until last summer. So I'm glad I got that covered as well. But I'm thrilled to be with all of you for the next 6 weeks, every Monday. And what we're going to try and do is unpack the issues of Israel and our neighbors, and we call it a fancy term of the archaeology of the conflict, but we're going to try and understand the history. And of course, as we learned in Nifty, we're not going to talk about history, we're going to talk about our story, because history is made up of two words, his story. So we're going to try and figure out how much of this story is really ours, how much of that story is recognized by the rest of the world. And of course, there's going to be politics and religion and wars and blood and action and love affairs, and everything's going to be involved here, hopefully to understand the issues that are really part of the land of Israel today. So, okay, let's go. I have a few interesting virtual tools that I hope will work. I heard you guys had an interesting Kol Nidre service during Yom Kippur, so you know where we are in that sense. Luckily, we try to avoid that, but as I was talking to Rabbi before, there are simply certain things in this world that we can't control. So, oh, wow, look at this. We got all kinds of fun stuff going on here. Okay, so you folks should be able to see my screen. Just give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen. Yes, we're good. Okay, so the archaeology of the conflict. My wife, Amy, is also a tour guide. I learned pretty much everything I know from her. She was a nifty educator as well, and she might pop in and help out every now and then, or maybe do one or two of the sessions. But the idea here is to understand more about the land of Israel. So when we talk about Israel, we have the map. The light blue is what's recognized by the world as the land of Israel. You'll see that there's sort of a turquoise color that's a little more shiny, which Israelis would say is part of the land of Israel. Some people in the world would say not really, or these are officially disputed territories, Judea and Samaria, or the occupied territories, or the West Bank, the Golan Heights, the Gaza Strip, which today is really not part of Israel at all. But we'll try to understand those, and we'll get to this map really later on in our tour. And if we ask someone else if this was a different tour today, they might show you the same map and say it's actually Palestine. and not the land of Israel or the state of Israel. So we're really talking about the same map. And a lot of times it depends on whose map you're looking at, especially in modern times, especially with internet sites. It's fascinating to see the different sides. And I try to be as objective as I can. I'll try to give you what both sides are saying about these stories, and hopefully let all of you make your own decisions about who's right and who's wrong, if there really is such a thing in this complicated place. So we'll do a quick, my timeline is out of sorts. Okay, so we'll go through our timeline. Don't worry, you don't have to memorize this. It will be on the test. Rabbi, did you tell him there's a test at the end? It will be on the test, but don't worry, you'll be able to review it. And we'll review this as we go along to understand the different time frames that we're talking about. So starting in the biblical period, we're really talking about 2000, and we in the tour guide business, we use the term BCE, which stands for before the Common Era. We don't use BC and AD, it's a Christian term. Nowadays, I don't know if you know this, but we tour guides have a new term. There's BC and AC, which is before COVID and after COVID. So that's going to be another part of our terminology someday. But 2000 BCE, meaning 3,000 or 5,000 years ago, sorry, maybe there was a guy named Abraham who walked this earth. We know the story from the Bible. And one of the things we'll talk about today is, how do we consider the Bible? Is it a textbook? Is it a history book? Is it a religious book? Is it both? Are there parts of the Bible that we can prove through archaeology that actually are correct, and there's actually evidence for that? So we'll deal with all of these issues in the next couple of sessions, because by the third session, we'll be out of the realm of the Bible, and we'll have other ways of connecting to the story and understanding it. So Abraham, the patriarchs and matriarchs, 5,000 years ago, something along those lines. And then around 1000 BC, 3,000 years ago, after we have the Exodus from Egypt and we have the 12 tribes entering the land, King David takes Jerusalem about 3,000 years ago, and his son Solomon builds the first temple in Jerusalem. And then Solomon dies, the kingdom divides. We'll talk about that a little more today. And eventually the Babylonians, the big bad Babylonians, come in. Nebuchadnezzar, one of my favorite words in English. The king comes in from Babylon, takes over, destroys Jerusalem, and destroys the temple. Anyone remember what day of the year the temple is destroyed? Ooh, pop quiz, trick question. The 9th of the month of Av, Tisha B'Av, you guys call it in America. Most Jewish kids that go to camp know about this, because it's the only sort of Jewish holiday that you can mention at camp, because what are you going to do? Our holidays are not during the summer. And Jews are exiled to Babylon, and we write songs over there, on the rivers of Babylon. And we write, on the rivers of Babylon, we sat and wept as we remember Zion. And eventually we came back, led by Ezra and Nehemiah. And we recreate the second temple, or recreate the temple, second temple version 2.0. And then in 332, we have Alexander the Great. He has a big grape on his head. Alexander the Great conquers the area, and it becomes Hellenistic, or Greek. And then in 167, we have the story of the Hasmonean rebellion, which you guys know the Hasmoneans more as the Maccabees. They rebel against the Greeks, and that's, of course, the story of the holiday of Hanukkah. Very good. I know that most American Jews think that Hanukkah is the most important holiday of the Jewish people. That is not, in fact, the case. In fact, it's a modern addition, relatively modern, and I'll mention that when we get to that time period. But Hanukkah is around 167, is the rebellion of Judah the Maccabee and his brothers against the Greeks. And then moving, what's going on here. Okay, and then moving forward, I'm sorry to break this to you, but the Maccabees or Hasmoneans were not good guys. We say that they were great for the Hanukkah thing, but after that, the next generation basically reconnects to the Greek culture that they were trying to get rid of. And they force convert lots of people around them. And eventually they're fighting between them, two brothers, about who's going to take over. And one of them invites the new superpower that comes up, the Romans, to take over and kill the other brother. And of course, the Romans kill both brothers and with very little resistance takes over the land. That's 63 BCE. And the Romans appoint a very important guy in our story, which we'll talk more about next week, a guy named Herod, King Herod, who builds a lot of cool stuff, the temple in Jerusalem, Masada, Caesarea, the Machpelah cave, and a few other places. And Herod dies at 4 BCE. And around the year 0, we have the birth of a very important guy. It's connected to our story, but most of the world thinks about this guy as the important issue here, and that is, of course, Jesus of Nazareth. And Herod dies. The Romans appoint governors instead of him. The most important governor is a guy named Pontius Pilate, Pontius Pilatus. He's really not important, but he's the most famous because he's the guy who condemns Jesus to crucifixion. And eventually in 66, the Jews rebel against the Romans. The Romans come down very hard on the Jews, destroy Jerusalem and destroy the temple that stands in Jerusalem. That is in 70 CE to the Common Era. And what day of the year does that happen? Anybody remember? Interestingly enough, it's on the same day as the destruction of the first temple, the 9th of the month of Av, Tisha B'Av. The same thing happened. By the way, a lot of interesting things are believed to have happened on the 9th of Av, Tisha B'Av, whether it's Ferdinand and Isabella putting out the decree that the Jews would be expelled from Spain, or it's the decision of Hitler and his henchmen to start gathering the Jews and massive killings. It wasn't a good day for the Jews, let's put it that way. And then after the Jews are essentially moved from Jerusalem, we're not allowed to be in Jerusalem at all. And then there's another rebellion against the Romans known as the Bar Kokhba Revolt. We'll talk more about it. You might have not heard it, not as famous, but the Roman emperor that destroys, fights against Bar Kokhba and Rabbi Akiva is a guy named Hadrian. And Hadrian is important in our story because Hadrian conquers the area. He destroys Jerusalem completely, he rebuilds it and renames it Ilia Capitolina. He also renames the land. He doesn't allow it to be called Judea anymore. It's now called Palestina. And we'll talk more about it when we get a little closer to that time period. Moving forward, 312 or 320 or so, a Roman emperor by the name of Constantine decides to convert the entire Roman Empire into Christianity. And that's essentially a very big change because his mother Helena comes to the land to identify locations of where the stories of Jesus took place. Constantine moves the center of the Roman Empire from Rome closer to the Holy Land and closer to the center of Christianity, to a city called Byzantium. He changes the name of the city. By the way, that's why we call it the Byzantine rule. The name of the empire changes to the Byzantines. But he changes the name of the city to Constantinople, which probably gives you a clue of what that is today. That's Istanbul in Turkey of today. Moving forward, the Roman Empire starts to collapse, and in 610 or so, a guy named Muhammad starts a new religion in the Arabian Peninsula. He changes the pagan religion in the area to Islam, and by 636, Islam takes over the area, and the Muslims take over the area of the land of Israel. And at around 750 or so, there's two important buildings that are built in Jerusalem, the Dome of the Rock and El Aqsa Mosque. More about that when we get to that time period. But really, that is the essence of the conflict and the issues that we have today. And around the year 1000 or so, there's a Muslim king in Cairo that rules the area, that decides to destroy all of the churches in the Holy Land. And that really angers a group of people that live in Europe. And in 1099, the Crusaders come to save the day. They take over the land, but they're really only here for about 250 years, because eventually the Mamelukes take over. There's no Papaluks, in case you were wondering. The Mamelukes take over. They're Muslims from Cairo, and the land is again under Muslim rule. The Ottomans from Turkey, Muslims, take over in 1517, and eventually in World War I, they lose to the British and the French, and the British take over the land, which starts the British Mandate, and eventually in 1948, the State of Israel is created. Okay, what I didn't add here, and we'll talk more about it towards the last sessions, is the modern State of Israel and what that did in terms of the borders and the conflict and the issues, and how archaeology, by the way, is a very, very important element in the conflict today. Israel has an archaeological narrative, the Palestinians have an archaeological narrative, and it doesn't match in a lot of places. And that's really why we named this session the Archaeology of the Conflict, because it's a way to really see how the biblical story, the Quran, the Christian Bible, the Jewish Bible, and the archaeology play a significant role in the conflict, and the who is here first and who's right and who does this spot belong to game that we're still playing with the rest of the world. All right, so the biblical period. Anybody know who this guy is? Don't worry, you've never seen a picture of him, neither have I. This is Baby, Abraham, as we like to call him. And as we said, Abraham lived 5,000 years ago, maybe. He comes from an area called Kasdim, which is located probably around Baghdad of today, Iraq of today. And I say probably because there are archaeological sites that we identified as Kasdim, but we didn't find any documents saying that Abraham actually lived in those cities. So definitely connect the story to ancient cities that were there at the time. So Abraham roamed the earth, as I said, around 5,000 years ago. And let's see a little bit of what we have. So let's go to the beginning. Who was Abraham, and did he really exist? So that's an interesting question. We do know that all three monotheistic religions, which Jerusalem is an important site for all three of those, call Abraham the father of their religion. And as you probably know, Judaism comes out in the beginning, Christianity stems out of Judaism, and eventually, this you may not know as well, the Quran has in it all of the stories of the Old Testament and the New Testament. In other words, the Muslims believe that what came before Muhammad is important. It's part of the story. Everyone that's mentioned in the Tanakh and the Jewish Bible and the Christian Bible, Abraham and David and Solomon and Moses and Jesus and St. Peter and all of those guys, they're all recognized and revered or respected by the Muslims. They're considered to be minor prophets. Islam believes that, of course, the major prophet is Muhammad, and that we all sort of got the right idea. We just don't exactly believe that Muhammad was the messenger of Allah, which is basically what they recite 5 times a day in their daily prayer, that they believe in Allah as the one God and that Muhammad is the true messenger of the true God. So the three religions stem out of Abraham. So the story of Abraham is a common thread, and there have been major attempts in the past, one of them not that long ago, Anyone know what the agreements between the Gulf states and Israel are named? It's the Abrahamic Agreement, or the Abrahamic Peace Accord. So they literally are using this idea of Abraham as the father of the three religions to try and get the connection, whichever we all agree on. Abraham is definitely the one that started all of this. Abraham, as we know, meets Sarah, and Sarah and Abraham have some fertility issues. And after many IVF cycles and after trying for many years to get pregnant, Sarah and Abraham have three visitors in their tents. And one of the visitors goes into the back where Sarah is preparing some food for the visitors. And the guy says to her, you know, you're pregnant. And she says, what do you mean? I was at my doctor yesterday and she didn't say anything about that. And he says, yeah, you're pregnant. And she thinks it's the best joke she heard in a long time. And she's laughing, disregards all of this. And eventually, as we know from the biblical story, these three visitors are actually angels. And in fact, when they leave, Abraham and Sarah discover that they are pregnant. Sarah, by the way, is 120 years old, according to the biblical story. Imagine that. And they have a son. The son's name is Yitzchak, or Isaac. Yitzchak comes from the word tzchok, or tzachak, which means laughter in Hebrew. So it literally means, when I heard that I was pregnant, I started laughing. So Yitzchak is the continuation of the lineage according to Judaism. However, and here's the catch, when Sarah and Abraham were not able to have children and to get pregnant, Sarah does not want Abraham's lineage to disappear. So she gives him her servant maid by the name of Hagar. This is all in the book of Genesis, by the way, Bereshit. And Hagar and Abraham have a son by the name of Yishmael, or Ishmael in English or in Arabic. And Yishmael comes from two words, Yishma, El. Yishma, heard, El, God. God heard my prayers to give Abraham a son. And the story that's in the Quran is that when Abraham and Sarah have Isaac, Sarah does something that's one of my favorite weekly portions, because it's an incredible drama that goes on there. Sarah convinces Abraham to banish Hagar and his firstborn son, Ishmael, away from the family. And the Bible says that they disappear into the desert. Ishmael, by the way, appears again in the story when Abraham dies and it's time to bury him. All of a sudden, it says that both Isaac and Ishmael get together to bury him in Hebron, which we'll visit very soon. So in the Quran, it says that Abraham did not continue and stay with Sarah and Isaac, but rather he understood that his firstborn is Ishmael. He leaves Sarah and Isaac, he goes into the desert and catches up with Hagar and Ishmael in the desert, in a place that they believe today is Mecca, and that the binding of Isaac, which we'll talk about soon, that brit, the covenant between Abraham and God, is not the binding of Isaac, but rather the binding of Ishmael. And this is the story in the Quran, and the place that it happened is Mecca. Okay, so it's all sort of a familiar story, but when Abraham is very old and Sarah dies before he does, Abraham is looking for a place to bury her. From Iraq, I didn't mention this, they wander through the what's known as the Fertile Crescent, and eventually go through northern Syria, eastern Turkey of today, and down the Mediterranean coast, Syria, Lebanon, and Israel of today, and they settle in the land of Canaan, which we have lots of references to where Canaan is. We know that it's what we call the land of Israel. And Abraham settles in a place called Beersheba, about 60 miles south of Jerusalem of today. And there's a tell there, there's an archaeological dig We know people lived there at that time period. We did not find a sign that says, "Welcome to Abraham and Sarah's humble home." So we don't know if Sarah and Abraham actually lived there, but when Sarah dies, he goes a little bit up north to Hebron, maybe 20 miles north of that, between Beersheba and Jerusalem, and he chooses a place to bury Sarah. And I have two videos for you, and let's see if you pick up the nuances of the politics that are involved in this, because as I said, everything that we'll talk about is political. So hopefully the technology will work. Can you guys hear?
Who owns the land of Israel? Who owns the actual dirt that's underneath of our feet? God gave possession of the land several times.
This is my colleague, another tour guide. I don't actually know him.
He does allow people to claim it as their own and to live in it as their own. In modern Israel, the land of Israel is owned by the nation of Israel. The property underneath of our feet, owned by the nation of Israel. In fact, if you buy a home in Israel, your home will sit on a piece of land that you lease from the government. Most likely you will not actually own it. But there is one piece of land
that's true, by the way,
completely different from that here in Israel. And that is a piece of land that has a title deed in the Bible. We're talking about Abraham and the piece of land which he came to, and he sought out the people who owned it, and he asked them if he could purchase it. And then he not only purchased it, but the title deed is written in the Bible. This is that.
Here, we're going to skip the explanation about the negotiations in the Middle East when you buy something, and we'll skip ahead to see a little bit more that Mr. Bob here is offering us.
Moment of God's covenant with him regarding the land. Perhaps that's why he wanted to make this legal purchase of the land when he could have had it for free. Abraham needed a place to bury his wife Sarah, and so he purchased this land, and she was buried here. Abraham was also buried here. Isaac, Rebekah, Leah, they were all here. Jacob was here. They're all buried here. This is a place where God made a covenant with Abraham. Abraham made a covenant to purchase the land. And we still yet today celebrate the fact that God's covenant is permanent, everlasting, and this place is a symbol of God's eternal covenant together with us as well.
So interestingly enough, notice some of the nuances that were said here. This is a deed that exists in the Bible. All of the patriarchs and matriarchs are buried here. Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, and Leah, and Jacob, and Leah. By the way, Rachel not buried here. She dies during childbirth on the way to Beersheba. She's buried in Bethlehem. But this is an interesting statement, that this is a deed given to the Jewish people by God. This is an important statement in the politics of today. By the way, this guy is an evangelical Christian. He's not an Orthodox Jew, although he's got a serious beard to show off over there. And as you know, the evangelical Christians, or maybe you don't know, the evangelical world in the United States especially, but also in Europe, Scandinavia, Germany, and other European countries, Brazil has a huge growing community of evangelical Christians, believe that the land of Israel was given to the Jewish people. And this is important in our modern politics because I don't know if you've heard of an organization known as CUFI, Christians United for Israel. It's a huge lobby on Capitol Hill, and they are very, very, very pro-Israel because of the idea that we are the rightful owners according to the Bible of this land. So it's an interesting issue to look at. I stopped here because I want to show you this structure. This is one of the best preserved sites built by King Herod. Herod the Great, we'll talk about him tomorrow. This structure is about 2,000 years old. And if you've been to the Western Wall, which I'm assuming many of you either have been or have seen pictures of, we believe that the top of the Western Wall actually looked like this, with these fake pillars sort of sticking farther up. Because you know the Western Wall has different layers of the time periods that were reconstructed. So this is a very cool building, which unfortunately a lot of people who come to Israel don't come to visit here because it's in the middle of the city of Hebron, which is a major conflict area between Israel and the Palestinians. Okay. Uh-oh. Okay. Let's see the other video.
The ancient
This
town of Hebron, with over 200,000 people,
a guy
is
named
the
Rick
largest
Steves
city
that
in
I
the
like
West
to buy
Bank.
his travel logs. I'm sure you've heard
And
of
it's
him.
the bustling,
And we'll take this to a minute 32. And he,
and it's all about this very sacred and complicated site.
so we're in Hebron, obviously.
An
with Rick
ancient
Steves.
structure capped by a medieval church, which now functions both as a mosque and a synagogue, holding the tombs of Abraham and his family. The focal point for both faiths is this, the tomb of Abraham. Poignantly, access for the feuding descendants of Abraham is divided by a pane of bulletproof glass. On one side of the glass, Jews worship in the synagogue, the second most holy place in Judaism. It's enlivened with singing, studying, and praying among the tombs of their great patriarchs. And the other half is a mosque, where Muslims worship before their shared patriarch with equal fervor. Its exquisite minbar, where the imam stands to give sermons, is a rare original from the 12th century, with inlaid wood and no nails.
He even uses the correct term in Arabic. I'm
Unfortunately,
impressed.
this holy place's history has a tragic aura.
For centuries, Jews were generally not allowed to worship here. Then, after the Israeli victory in the War of 1967, the space was shared by Jews and Muslims. But during a Muslim service in 1994, an Israeli settler entered here with his gun and killed 29 Palestinian worshippers. Since then, this holy space has been divided, emblematic of the difficult challenges that permeate the Holy Land.
So again, I'm assuming you're starting to understand the nuances that I'm talking about. What's interesting about what Rick Steves shared, what happened to my, hold on, it was bound to happen at some point, some technical issues. What's interesting that Rick Steves shared here is the idea that, that this is a place of, here, I think I fixed it.
Gadi, as you're
Yes.
looking, it's also true, I think, and it's an interesting place to start. We talk about the archaeology of the conflict. It has been a flashpoint in the conflict several times in terms of terrorist attacks on both sides and ongoing challenges with knife attacks and other things as well.
Yes. And unfortunately, the what he's talking about, he mentions it in the beginning. Rick Steves says that for centuries, Jews were not allowed to pray here because during the Muslim rule, Jews were allowed to come here. They weren't allowed to pray openly. It was not a place where Jews felt comfortable. And in fact, even today, the synagogue side looks like a mosque because the last version of the building, as he mentions, is a church from the 12th century, which is when the Crusaders came in, which was turned over when the Mamelukes come in 1250 into a mosque. And since then, it is in fact a mosque and very much in contention. Hebron is a very, very loaded place. And as I said, unfortunately, a lot of people don't come to visit there because of these issues. But according to the belief of both sides, by the way, Muslims and Jews believe that all of the patriarchs and matriarchs are buried over here. And of course, for the Muslims, Abraham's tomb is important. These things that we saw, those building little monuments that we saw are not the actual tombs. They're markers. The tombs are underneath. And wouldn't it be amazing to be able to dig underneath those markers and to see what we really find there? So there's a fascinating story about an opening that was discovered on the Israeli side before 1948. And during the sort of a siege and a battle that was going on during what we call the War of Independence, in 1948, there was a child, a kid, because it was so small that they needed someone small. A girl was actually lowered down into that opening, and she came back with stories and sketches of an additional marker that is underneath the tomb of Abraham. So we did have an opportunity to sort of go underneath there, but that's going to be a main issue that we'll talk about a lot, that these sacred sites, we really can't excavate underneath them, and we really can't find archaeological evidence. And in a way, it's good for one side and good for the other side, because of the lack of ability to go underneath and check it out. All right, so 1200 BCE, 3,200 years ago or so, the Exodus from Egypt. We know that the story of Exodus, Moses leads the people. I forgot to mention that when Jacob marries Leah and then marries Rachel, and they have 12 sons and a daughter. A lot of people don't know about the daughter, but if you read Anita Diamond's Red Tent, it's a great book, talks about the tents of Jacob with the perspective of the women. They all head down to Egypt because there is a famine in the land. And the breadbasket of the time, the closest one, there were two actually, Mesopotamia, between the rivers of the Euphrates and the Tigris, that's Iraq of today. But closer to Canaan was the land of the Nile, Egypt, and they end up over there, according to the Bible. That's the end of the book of Genesis. And the beginning of the book of Exodus, we have the story of the people, the 12 sons multiply and become a people. And from that, we have the 12 tribes of Israel. If you remember the story of Jacob fighting against the angel, he beats the angel in a wrestling match, and the angel says to him, from this point on, I'm changing your name to from Jacob to Israel, which means Yisrael, wrestled with God and prevailed. So from this point on, the Israel, or Jacob, his 12 sons become the 12 tribes of Israel. And when Moses leads them out of the desert, they arrive into the land. They come, by the way, from this direction, from here, and they end up somewhere over here. I think there's even, it says Mount Nebo on the map. Mount Nebo is where Moses stands and sees, it's the end of the book of Sefer Dvarim, Rabbi. What is that in English? The last book in the Torah, Leviticus. I always confuse them. Deuteronomy, okay. I always confuse them. But the end of that book is Moses looking into the land, and then Joshua leads the people through the Jordan River, which is an interesting element of going to the mikveh, right? It's cleansing through the waters. It's the waters of the Jordan River cleanse the people as the old generation dies off. They're not allowed to come into the land. I'll mention that in a moment. And the new generation, led by the new leader Joshua, leads them into the land, and they conquer the land, and each tribe gets a piece of land, as you can see in this map. Why are the people wandering for 40 years from Egypt to the land of Israel? It does not take 40 years to go from Egypt to Israel, even if you're leading tens of thousands of people, which is the estimate of how many people we're talking about. When Moses is up on Mount Sinai, the natives are getting restless. They convince Aaron to take all the gold and create what? Anybody remember? The golden calf, oy vey. They're worshiping a different god. And because of that, God's punishment is that the generation of the desert will wander around for 40 years. They will die off, and their children will be able to enter the promised land, the golden Medina. So they eventually enter in here, and the land is divided. As you can see, some of these tribes, the tribe of Menashe, Gad, and Reuben, are on the other side of the Jordan River. Today, that is the country Jordan. There are some Israelis and some Jews that say, what's going on? this is part of our promised land as well. And our ancestors sat in this part of the land of Canaan, and therefore the country Jordan should really belong to the land of Israel, or to the country of Israel. So this is what it looks like about 1200 BCE, if in fact the story is correct. By the way, there is absolutely no archaeology to support the story of Exodus. There's lots of really interesting theories and lots of really interesting ways of trying to support findings about the parting of the Red Sea and about the slav, the birds that fall from the sky and the manna and all of these stories, but there really isn't any archaeology to support that. We also don't know where Mount Sinai is. There's 3 different locations that are believed to be Mount Sinai. So that's an interesting idea. By the way, there's a wonderful book, Bruce Feiler, I think is his name, that wrote Walking the Bible. It's a great book. He literally takes one of my teachers in my tour guide course, a guy named Avner Goen, who's a sort of a legend around here, a tour guide and a professor, and walks with Avner Goen, trying to follow the stories of the Bible. He goes to find Noah's Ark, and he goes to Egypt and tries to walk along the Sinai Desert according to the story. Very interesting, definitely recommend it. And I'll send to Rabbi Riegler my list of recommended readings and movies and stuff that you can follow up with. And everything that I mention is on that list for sure. All right, I see I'm talking too much. We'll continue. Everybody okay? You guys are hanging in there? All right, so this brings us to the First Temple period. And this guy, anyone know who this is? Again, we don't have any pictures. We do have a statue that Michelangelo created. This is David, and King David was a celebrity, he was a rock star. We'll talk about him very soon. And when David takes control, because in the past, the 12 tribes of Israel had the judges, the period of the judges, Deborah and a few others, Samuel as a prophet, sort of judge, and eventually the people say to Samuel, we want a king. And the first king of Israel is, anybody remember? Hint, it's not the famous one, it's not David. It's a guy named Saul, Shaul. And Saul was chosen because he was very tall and impressive. Seriously, that's what the story in the Bible says. He was not a very good politician. And Saul was actually from the tribe of Benjamin. Okay, you see where Benjamin is over here. Benjamin is the youngest son. He's the second son of Rachel, beloved by Jacob, of course, because he came from his beloved wife. And many times the tribe of Judah, which is a very big tribe and a very strong tribe, was butting heads with Benjamin. There was a lot of arguments between them. So David conquers Jerusalem. We'll get into Jerusalem very soon. And according to, if we understand the extension that it's talking about for David and for Solomon about 3,000 years ago, the map that you see here is the expansion of David and Solomon according to the description of the Tanakh. So look at this. Some of the Sinai Peninsula, by the way, all of this is desert. Nobody lives here. There's really not much to do here until you get to the Nile. And along the Red Sea here. And down here is a place that's believed to be Tarshish. One of the places that we believe is Tarshish. Tarshish was mentioned in your services on Yom Kippur. Anybody remember where? That was a big hint. Jonah is told to go to Nineveh, which is up here. Nineveh is basically here, but he does not do that. And instead, what does he do? He goes gets on a boat to Tarshish, completely in the other direction. And notice the expansion up here all the way to the Euphrates River. Maybe as far as this is northern Syria, eastern Turkey of today. There are Jews that would claim if this was the land that David and Solomon owned, then we should be able to own this land as well. Not a lot of support there, but that's definitely part of it. Solomon dies, and after Solomon dies, the kingdom is divided into two kingdoms. The kingdom of Judea, the southern kingdom, and the kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdom. 10 tribes go with one of the generals of the army, a guy named Jeroboam, Yerovam ben Nevat, and they create the kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdom, and Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, continues to rule from Jerusalem. Okay, this is important. We'll get back to it soon, but now we'll move to a different technology that we have here, I hope. What happened here? Interesting. Okay, hold on. We'll figure it out in a minute. I think my, there we go. All right, now it'll work. So we're going to go virtually tour in the area of Jerusalem. So let's start with the land of Israel in general and try to understand in the map today, what are we talking about? Okay, so when we talk about Israel, we're talking about this piece over here. And as you know, as we saw in the different maps, we have different questions about whether or not some of this in fact belongs to Israel or not. And of course, where all of this converges, and it's a big issue, is the city of Jerusalem. And Jerusalem, if you remember the map, was right on the border between the tribe of Benjamin in this area in the north and the tribe of Judah to the south. And David understands that Saul, the king before him, who's a Benjaminite, was favoring his people. And in order to make sure that everyone believes in him as the true king, he conquers the city of Jerusalem and makes it the capital of his kingdom. We call it the Israelite kingdom. And of course, in Jerusalem, the old city of Jerusalem, this basically 1 square mile is where all of this converges together. And we'll talk a lot about the different issues that we have here. So of course, it's important for the Jewish people because of the Western Wall. A remnant of the temple. We'll talk more about that next week. It's important to the Christian world because of this. This is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, or the Holy Tomb, where Jesus is believed to have been buried and resurrected. And of course, the top of the Temple Mount, the Dome of the Rock, and we'll understand what that is in a moment to see what's underneath this. But this is the third most important site for the Muslim world. And as you well know, this is the Western Wall, and right above it is the Dome of the Rock. So the Muslim and Jewish locations are literally right on top of each other. Thankfully, and I say this half jokingly but half seriously, the Christian holy site, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, is about 500 yards away in the old city. So if we zoom in a bit, you can see the Temple Mount over here, the Dome of the Rock, the Western Wall over here, and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is about 500 yards away from where all of this is. So it's good that we're not all fighting about the same place, but you'll see soon that the Christians are interested in the Temple Mount as well. So the city that David takes over is really, we'll look at a few maps in a moment, but you can see there's the Kidron Valley over here, and there's another valley, or a very small valley over here. And this finger in the middle is where the city of Yevus, city of Canaanite people, is located, which David comes and conquers to make it the capital of his kingdom. David is a bad boy. We'll talk about it more soon. He does some things that God does not want him to do. Most important one is that he sends The wife, he sends his general off to a suicide mission so that he could marry his wife, Bathsheba. And because of this, and because David conquers a lot of land and kills a lot of people, God punishes him. And the punishment is that his son Solomon will eventually build the temple here at the top of the hill. So take a look. We have the Kidron Valley that we just saw, the Tyropian Valley, or the Valley of the Cheesemakers, it's called. Why, we don't actually know, but if you watched Monty Python, Life of Brian, you probably heard their jokes about the cheesemakers. But this ridge over here is where the city of Jerusalem originally starts. So it's protected from 3 sides, and at the top of it, above, is a place called Mount Moriah, or Moriah. According to the Jewish tradition, this is where Adam and Eve, when they're banished from the Garden of Eden, are brought down to start their life in this world and life on earth. So the top of the hill is known as the foundation stone, the foundation of the world. We believe that later on, when Abraham is tested by God to sacrifice his son Isaac, he's told to go from Beersheba, which is to the south, about 60 kilometers, 40 miles, to, God says to him, Lech le'eretz ha-Moriah, go to the land of Moriah. And eventually he comes to Mount Moriah. And if you analyze the word Moriah, it's 2 words again. More, what is more? Teacher. Yah is 2 letters out of the 4 letters of the Israelite God. So it's literally the place that God will show you. Moriah. And we believe that the same foundation stone where Adam and Eve started their life on earth, this is where Abraham almost sacrifices Isaac. This is where the covenant, the brit, between Abraham and God is closed. And as you know, when a Jewish child is born, what do? We have a celebration of the bris, which is the brit, or bringing that child into the covenant of Abraham and God. So Mount Moriah, eventually where Solomon builds the temple, is this same hill on the top of the city of Jerusalem, which begs the question, how did David know to conquer Jerusalem? Did he know about Mount Moriah? Did he know about the Brit, the covenant between Abraham and God, and Mount Moriah? Maybe. The biblical narrative would, of course, suggest that God's plan was all along to bring Jerusalem to the forefront of our people, and perhaps this is part of the story. Later on, the city, this is the modern city of today. You can see, this is during the Second Temple, or the time of Herod. We have the Temple Mount. We'll focus on that in our next event. And here we can see a model of Jerusalem. This is already during the time of King Hezekiah, when the city expands from this finger that we talked about earlier to the other side, known as the Western Hill, Mount Zion of today. And King Hezekiah is going to be the star of our next edition. Oh, and look at that. I did bring pictures of Abraham and Isaac. By the way, if some biblical scholars calculated how old Isaac was during this event, and they came up with 34. So clearly this picture is not complete, not really true. Maybe this one a little better. But according to the biblical story, Isaac was already 34 years old when all of this takes place. Yofi. So let's see how much of the archaeology that we have today is actually giving us the idea of what of the location of Jerusalem. So, skipped over. So first of all, do we have any remains of the first temple up here on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem? And the answer is maybe. The real answer is we don't know, because we're not able to excavate underneath the building that's there today, the Dome of the Rock. So we believe that there was a temple here, according to the story. And what's interesting is that we found a model that might be what the temple that Solomon built looks like. And I don't know if you've ever been here, but I'm going to take you all the way to the top of Israel to the north. a place called Tel Dan. It's right on the border. You see, look at this. This is the border between Israel and Lebanon. Okay, it's right at the top of Israel. And Tel Dan is a place where there were excavations done. And the archaeologist found a very cool structure that most people that come to Israel don't visit, unfortunately. What is this? We found some kind of what we call a monumental building. And if you look at it, I think there's a picture later on that we'll see. There was some kind of structure here. These folks are sitting on steps leading down to an inner courtyard and an outer courtyard. Okay, in the inner courtyard, there's an altar that, according to the description of the Temple of Solomon in the Bible, in the Tanakh, the Book of Kings, there's a description of exactly this: the Holy of Holies in the temple as a structure, an outside courtyard where all of Israel are allowed, and an inside courtyard where only the Levites and the Kohanim were allowed in, where the sacrifices were made in the temple. So here's a few illustrations of what we think the Temple of Solomon might have looked like, with the altar outside, the building, and the Holy of Holies in the back. And perhaps what we were looking at over there is in fact what we saw. And here, once again, if you look at what the picture we just saw, there's the sort of the courtyard out here with the altar. And when you go into the building, there's a section where there's just a building, and then in the back is the Holy of Holies. So what are we looking at here? Because we're not in Jerusalem. Remember that the kingdom split between the northern and the southern kingdoms, and Jeroboam, the first king of the kingdom of Israel, the 10 tribes, could not send his people to Jerusalem because they were fighting with the kingdom of Judea. So the Bible says to us, the story is in Kings 2, that he builds 2 temples in Dan, which is where we are now, and in Bet El. Bet El is believed to be in Ramallah of today. So in the 2 ends of his kingdom, very close to Jerusalem, and all the way at the northern edge, he builds a temple. And it's interesting because what we found here, archaeologists believe, is the temple that Jeroboam built. And it stands to reason that he would build it according to what the people knew the temple in Jerusalem would have looked like, with the outer courtyard and the inner courtyard and the main building of the temple itself. So I think this is one of the coolest things that we can see in Israel. Now you're probably thinking to yourself, so wait, why is this not the holiest place in Israel, and why don't millions of tourists flock to this place? And the answer is because the continuation of that story in Kings 2 is that after Jeroboam, Yerovam, builds these temples, what does he put in the temple? A golden calf. Oy vey. What's the golden calf all about? It's the Bible's way to say Jeroboam did the wrong thing. He was not supposed to do that, because we know that your temple, for example, is called Temple Shalom, but it's a Mikdash Me'at. It's a mini temple. Nothing can compare to the temple in Jerusalem. And in fact, we are not allowed to build any other temple rather than the temple in Jerusalem. That must be what we strive for. So this is not recognized by many traditional Jews, and of course not the ultra-Orthodox Jews, because this is a place of idol worship. Jeroboam strayed away from the path that he was supposed to go. So next time you come on a tour, we'll go to visit here, one of my favorite spots to talk about. I usually say that Jeroboam was one of the first Reformed Jews, and that was one of the first Reformed temples ever created, because it's essentially taking what we have and making it into what we want to see. So, yes.
I just want to be aware of the time, because I know there are people that only have an hour to be with us. We are together again, actually in 2 weeks is the next session that I have. So we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
I'm actually going to stop the recording a minute. I'm sorry to pause you in the middle. I don't know if you
No,
want
this
to
is good. This is a good spot to stop on.
I feel like it was very light on content today, but no. So thank you so much for this introduction. Diving in quite deep on the biblical history and bringing us to this point. We look forward to seeing everybody in 2 weeks. Yeah, stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll see you soon.
Very good.
Thank you, Gadi.
Toda rabba. And Rabbi has my email. If anyone has any questions and you want to send them to me, feel free to send me some emails or save them for 2 weeks from now when we'll be able to do this again.
That's perfect. Thank you so much, Gadi. Be well.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Wonderful.